Imagine. Imagine that years into the future, mental illnesses just stopped being accepted. That everyone who has a mental illness is considered abnormal and is outcasted from society. And due to that unacceptance, suicide rates skyrocket. Sounds terrible, right? Being excluded from society for something that you can't control. Well, that's how some people feel to this day. They feel excluded from society because of prejudice fused from the peers around them. That's called a social stigma. Social stigma is the disapproval of or discrimination against an individual or group based on perceived characteristics that serve to distinguish them from other members of a society. Most of these perceived characteristics come from the media. The media associates mental illness with violence, danger, criminality, and avoidance. And people believe it. People believe that everyone with a mental illness is violent or dangerous and should be avoided. Fortunately, though, these stereotypes have lessened throughout generations. Actually, a lot of things have changed about the ideation of mental illnesses. For example, the acceptance. For a long time, mental illnesses were seen as abnormal or strange. And as long as I've known, it's confused me. And because of that belief, people weren't able to get the proper treatment they need. Now, thankfully, mental illnesses are widely accepted and people can get the treatment they need. As I mentioned before, I've been confused on how mental illnesses were seen as strange. This confusion comes from my own experience. I myself have mental illnesses, anxiety, and depression. And as long as my parents have known, they've accepted them. They learn to adapt to things so they can help. So learning that somebody's parents or just the people around them don't accept them confused me. Also learning the fact from Kansas State University that over half of all youth who have depression have attempted to take their own life, and over 7% have actually passed from that, is extremely upsetting. I've learned from the National Library of Medicine that the stigma around mental illness is harder for people to deal with than the actual mental illness itself. That sounds unbelievable, but if you really think about it, it makes sense. The stigma causes a lot of things: bullying, violence, low self-esteem, and suicide. And if someone with a mental illness saw any of those things happening, they'd be too ashamed to get help. They'd be too ashamed to tell anyone the truth because they get treated differently because of it. And I know that's true because the same thing happened to me. Before I got the official diagnosis that I had anxiety and depression, which was last year, I was afraid to admit I thought I had them. And this fear came from the media and the beliefs of those around me. Because as I mentioned before, the media associates mental illness with violence and danger. I didn't want people to think I was violent or was gonna hurt them. I didn't want people to think of me like that. Also, I thought I had anxiety and depression in 2020. And around that time on TikTok, anxiety and depression seemed like a trend. People thought it was a trend to have these mental illnesses. But they didn't fully grasp what the mental illness actually did to you. They thought just because they were sad or stressed once, they had anxiety or depression. And because of this, it was extremely common for people to self-diagnose. But they need to understand that a mental illness isn't a one-time thing. It affects people at all times, no matter when. It could be at home, at school, when they're talking to their friends, or when they're resting. It doesn't matter when. It affects them at all times. And because of this trend, I didn't tell my parents for 3 years. So when I finally got a therapist, I was able to tell her everything. At first, it was uncomfortable. I was scared to tell her things because I thought she would think I was weird. But I got used to it, and it felt so refreshing. But the hardest part was actually telling people about my diagnosis. I had kept secret that I had anxiety and depression for a bit before I had my therapist and my parents. I knew that they were going to accept it, but I was still scared. Social anxiety is one of the hardest things I struggle with, and that's because it affects me in most situations. For example, going to the store, meeting new people, presenting in class, giving a TED Talk, but complimenting people, but most of all, telling people about my feelings. But that's actually the only reason why I'm here right now, is because of my anxiety. The fact that I'm able to talk to all you guys, multiple people online, on this stage, really pushes me out of my comfort zone. This is extremely hard for me to do. I'm freaking out right now, and my heart is beating out of my chest. However, I know that not many people get these opportunities. So when I got the opportunity to talk about how others and I feel about this topic, I took it. I want to inform others about how this affects people to this day. And now I'm able to. So if you ever get the opportunity to talk about your struggles with mental illness, take it. And I just want to say, when I told you to imagine in the beginning, just know that some people don't have to imagine that. That's how they're feeling right now. And the next time you hear the words mental illness, think back to my TED Talk and remember the struggles that I and many other people have been through. Don't be the person to make them ashamed of speaking out. Be the person who helps.